Well, welcome back. My name is Jurgen, if you're just joining us, and thank you, and welcome to the PM for the World conference, a conference designed to generate funds for relief efforts in Turkey and Syria, but also to give you knowledge and insight into how to deal with a whole range of disasters, how to be proactive in preparing for that. We've just heard from Sarah, and we now have an opportunity of a panel discussion where I'm going to invite Sarah and two other guests to come in and explore a little bit more how we, within PMOs or within organizations, can create the environments in which we can support disasters, both in the moment and then also building a more sustainable solution. So you've already met Sarah. I will introduce her again very briefly in just a moment for those of you who maybe missed her presentation. If you did, I do recommend that you go back and listen to it again. We will also be hearing from Amman Mia, and again, I will introduce her formally in just a moment, and then my final panelist, Brad Moffat. So, running through them, Sarah Fox, the head of PMO for what used to be Resilience New South Wales, now Infrastructure New South Wales, the role they're designed to firstly help Australia or New South Wales deal with the impact of the bushfires that we had in late 2019 and followed very quickly by floods in 2019 or 2020 and continuously since then. Amani is the second guest, a veteran portfolio and program project management consultant. Someone I've known for probably 20, 25 years, used to be one of my students and has now become the master. When I look at the bio of what she's done, worked in a whole range of different organizations in portfolio management capacities. Many of Australia's blue chip companies listed in her own portfolio. But Amani here, particularly because of the work that she did as part of the portfolio management office while she was at the Catholic Diocese for Maitland, Newcastle. And that was a time when COVID hit, where suddenly the diocese had to deal with that disaster alongside all of the floods that were happening and impacting on schools and some of the other properties there. Amani currently works at the federal government in Canberra and is very, very well known in PMI circles. She's been a chapter president for PMI Sydney, is also a member of the AIPM and has a whole host of credentials in project management, speaks regularly at events. So Amani, we look forward to hearing from you in just a moment. And then my third panelist, or third guest, Brad Moffat, who is a supply chain professional with over 25 years of experience in that industry. He's currently working as a general manager for engineering and delivery for SSI Schaefer, a logistics provider, and not really a project manager as such, but worked a lot with project management. And we invited Brad in particular because of the work that he did about a decade ago when he was head of the National Logistics Support for Woolworths, one of the big retail companies in Australia, and was tasked with helping communities and Woolworths re-engage after a whole series of cyclones hit northern New South Wales. So between the three of them, we cover the commercial, the government, and the not-for-profit sector and how to deal with disaster recoveries. So what I'm going to do is just get each of them to take maybe 5 minutes to quickly recap their work specific to disaster recovery, and then we'll go into some questions. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them up into the chat as well. So once I've gone through a few, I'll invite questions from you too. So Sarah, if I can, I know you've just spoken quite a while, but if I can just get you very quickly to recap the key points of what your role was in disaster recovery.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Jurgen, for the introduction and the opportunity to join this panel. Look, I'm really quite passionate, I guess, about the role of the project management office in working in a context of, response and recovery. And those roles are different, varied across different agencies. But I think that what I was trying to communicate in the presentation is also that power of the PMO to understand, the strategy, making sure strategy is fed through to implementation, and having that strategic line of sight to enable decision making at critical times. And critical decision making, you need timely decision making when a disaster hits, and that is in relation to, what gets put on hold, what resources can we enable to respond effectively, and what projects need to continue as a strategic priority. And that, is a role that the PMO was able to play at the former Resilience New South Wales. And we were also able to, I guess, bring in a surge capacity our skill set, which was, stakeholder management, agile project methodology, design thinking, human centered design. How do we set up things for success quite quickly? How do we iterate? How do we fail fast and learn from our failings? And how do we, really support the organisation with the critical pieces? And for us, that was the statewide recovery dashboard that had, over 37 agencies contributing data and information. Had spatial satellite images coming through. We, provided that report on a daily basis to National Cabinet and the Premier, and to other state government agencies who are using that information to make decisions in their recovery operations and in the response as well. So, look, it was a critical time for us, and we were newly established as the PMO. Fortunately, we were able to have some rungs on the board. We had worked with quite a diverse group of project stakeholders across the agency, and many of those were operational, and they knew our skill set. They trusted us to help, deliver this piece of work. So we're able to step in quite easily and readily and quickly, and get alongside our colleagues as we responded and focused on the recovery operation of the floods from last year.
Great, thank you. Now, one of the things that you mentioned there is this challenge of deciding where to put your funds, what to put on the hold, etc. And that's a role that Amani was very much involved in her work. So, Amani, if you could just give us a quick overview of what you were doing.
Thank you, Jurgen. I've been humbled by your introduction. I've learned from the best of the best, so thank you. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're on today and pay my respect to their past, present, and emerging. As Jurgen said, I worked for the Catholic Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle from October 2019 to 2021. And my role was managing the portfolio management office, which is a little bit different than your project management office. The task was really overlooking at the whole portfolio in terms of the projects that are running, the strategic alignment, and enabling to prioritize, mobilize, and resource all of these projects. So the events that happened were bushfires. We had bushfires in 2019. Our involvement was not much in terms of hands-on on the ground. However, we had to dig out the business continuity plan in terms of preparation for COVID. As COVID started bubbling around the globe, people started being uncertain. So our first task was on having a look at the business continuity plan, revisiting it in terms of the whole agency. The Catholic Diocese has 60 schools that are managed by the Catholic Schools Office. It's got a number of around 20 at that time early education centers under the St. Nicholas umbrella, a number of out-of-school services, and as well as Pathways, which is a program in order to train interested community members in taking a career in early education. In addition to that, the Agency of Catholic Care taking care of the vulnerable, offering community services, food, language help, and so on, foster care as well. In addition, of course, to the churches, pastoral services, and so on. So it's really multifaceted. All of this is supported by a backbone of your usual finance, IT, business analytics, a large portfolio of property that's got to do with both construction of new schools, education centers, and so on, as well as maintaining the current property portfolio and ensuring it's really well equipped to cater for the large numbers of students, staffs, and communities within the whole archdiocese. So when COVID, in addition to the business continuity plan, we had to go through a prioritization exercise in terms of looking what projects can stop in terms of the current environment, what projects need to start as an initiative that really need to respond to the whole COVID situation, and what things need to be accelerated in order for it to go on running. Examples of that, we had plans for schools where property needs to continue in terms of building, and thank God the government was still supporting that in terms of the public health orders, and therefore that continued to run in terms of building the schools and early education, because some schools had really to transfer and they had an intake to be ready for the next calendar year. In terms of stopping or initiating new ones, accelerating new ones, we had a rollout project for Microsoft Teams, for example, that was planned to take place in 18 months. That happened in 3 weeks instead of 18 months. Why is that? Because of the urgency, because of a common purpose, and because of an understanding that all hands had to be in deck. So from the head of IT to the most junior person, everyone was mobilized in order for us to assist with rolling out, ensuring that everyone within schools, within staff, within the whole archdiocese, including the bishop who learned how to use Zoom and Microsoft Teams at that time, to be able to continue with business as usual as much as possible. Having said that, mobilizing certain projects and dedicating resources to others, ended up we had to stop certain projects and put them on hold. And that prioritization helped in terms of the focus, in terms of a common message to everyone, what needs to be done, where the priorities are, and so on. And the community, whether inside the diocese, inside the schools, inside the staff, or the community at large, pulled out together to support each other and be able there. The EPM role was really in terms of the prioritization, ensuring the running of all of these projects and capturing lessons learned as we go in order to improve our processes and disseminate the communication and the information to everyone accordingly.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I really pick up is in life as a whole, but in a disaster in particular, we can't do everything. So we have to be very strategic on where we focus our attention, and that means knowing what to prioritize, knowing what's important. Something else I picked up just in what you were describing is that in every dark cloud, there is a silver lining. In every disaster, there is an opportunity to actually accelerate and get things done if we focus our attention in the correct areas. So that's an element that we may explore in a moment. Moving from a government perspective and a not-for-profit, what about the commercial sector itself? Brad, your role at Woolworths and logistics and trying to get Woolworths and communities back up and up to speed. Tell us a little bit about the background, please.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this forum today in such a great cause. So as Jurgen introduced me a little earlier, I don't necessarily, I wasn't in this particular time at Woolworths in a project capacity. However, prior to this role, I spent a decade in major infrastructure project implementations and so on. So I guess my grounding was definitely with projects. And being an engineer at heart as well, I'm very familiar with structure, and moved into this role with Woolies at the time. And one of the aspects of the role was ownership of business continuity and disaster recovery planning. And it was a very new and unfamiliar role for me. We looked after many aspects of the supply chain within Woolworths, and like I say, this was part of it. My first exposure, I suppose, to a chaotic situation was part of my role was around event planning, and being a big retailer, major events like Christmas and Easter, they're big events for those organisations. And we were heading into a particular Christmas event, and we'd done all the planning, and coming from that project background before, everything was working well, and we were ticking things off, and it was lovely. Until one morning, very close to Christmas, the phone started to call at about 2:30 in the morning, and on the other end of the phone was one of my team members, and we were saying, have you checked the numbers for today in the supply chain? It's like, no, I haven't. It's 2 in the morning. And so anyway, had a look, and through the bleary eyes, I'm looking at the numbers, and being in supply chain, we're driven by volumes and things like that and efficiencies. And I'm looking at these numbers thinking, this can't be right. There's no way on earth this could be right. Anyway, go through a validation process, and they were unfortunately correct. And I knew in that moment that I was going to have a very, very bad day. And indeed it did. Now, I guess I tell that story in that at that particular point in time, coming from a project background into a new role, I was not prepared for this situation, in this element of chaos. And I was merely a passenger through this event, and coming out the other side of it, I learned a lot. But one thing I said to myself at the time was, after having probably the worst day of my career, that will never happen again. I'm never going to let that happen again. And so fast forward a few months, and I was thrust into our first real chaotic situation, I suppose you might say, where we had a major flood event unfolding up in far north Queensland. And once again, a little bit of deja vu. The phone started ringing again quite early in the morning, and we're going through the process. Now, my team, as I mentioned, we own business continuity plans. So, I had the plans in front of me and things like that. But what I kind of quickly learnt was those particular plans at the time, when we were dealing with crisis, we didn't really have the time to go through them, point by point, and deal with the ever-changing situation as it is changing by the minute. And so I needed to, I suppose at the time, allow myself to breathe and take that step back and go, right, what am I about? What are my principles about here in project, from a project background, and how can I apply them in this situation? And I guess instincts started to kick in, and it's like, right, who do I need? What do I need? What's the information I need? And started to get that structure put around this situation. And I guess that started to form the way in which we dealt with crisis situations and those chaotic situations moving forward. It was very much adaptive. It was learn on the fly. As much as we had the plans there, they served as more or less a roadmap, but certainly not a playbook or anything that we were following step by step. It was really about ensuring that we had the right people, we had crisp, clear communications, we had validated data as best as we could, because the data's changing all the time, and then just going through that process of iterating, learning, failing fast, as we've talked about before, and then going and implementing, and at the end of it all, ensuring that we took a step back and we unpacked what had happened and what we can take into the next event, because invariably, living in Australia as we do around the world, we deal with these types of situations quite frequently, and there's always the opportunity to do it better.
Correct, thank you. So a couple of the key things that have come out from all three: the absolutely important to be prepared, to actually think ahead before a crisis hits. I think in every country, we know crises are going to happen. So how do we start preparing? How do we start getting the right data? How do we start equipping the right people that we're going to need to get out onto the field? And then clear communication, how to structure that sort of communication. And just, Brad, picking up on one thing, you talked there about having a roadmap rather than a playbook. Can you just go into that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, our plans would often be very, very detailed. It's almost like a decision tree. If X, go here, follow this flow path. Unfortunately, natural disasters very rarely follow that playbook, and so we had to deal and obviously think on our feet. So I guess what I'm saying is that we needed to kind of bubble things up into scenarios. So, if we're dealing with a particular scenario and that particular, scenario occurs for a given period of time, then we will take this general approach. Or if it goes for an extended period of time, we will go in a different way, or build upon that original approach. So it couldn't be too prescriptive. And we needed to have a lot of, I suppose, knowledgeable people embedded into the decision-making criteria, in that huddle, if you like, that team, that we could then follow that game or that strategic roadmap. But the important part, I guess, was really around decision-making in the times of crisis and things are moving very quickly. It's quite easy to make the tactical decisions, moving on the fly. And you can sort of maneuver within a fairly small corridor. But at some point in time, when things are nasty and getting pretty bad, you're going to have to make some big calls and big decisions. And those decisions take a time to implement, and they take money and resource, and almost, or if not as importantly, they take time to unwind as well. And so those decisions need to be made by the right people. And that's, I think, what part of the preparation process is really about, is getting those steps of escalation clearly understood. Who would be responsible for making those decisions, and under what general criteria?
Because maybe taking project management into some challenging areas. Project management is all about who's going to do what, when. Historically, in a waterfall environment, we think we can predict it all and plan it all out neatly, but we've seen that in a crisis, those plans just don't work. I think it was Helmut von Moltke, a German war general, who said plans are absolutely imperative, but the moment that battle begins, throw them out the window, because your rule book or the playbook has changed. And Sarah, your agency was set up specifically in response. So was there an element of pre-planning ahead of time, or it was very much because the fires were happening, you needed to do something? There wasn't a business continuity plan that you were trying to enact. It was jumping in on the fly.
Yeah, so look, resilience, so the Office of Emergency Management was quite a small agency. I think had about 40 staff. And so when we went through the bushfires, state government agencies needed to surge staff into the Office of Emergency Management and really bolster that organisation. And, it was really clear that we needed, a larger size organisation to support the recovery efforts and the coordination efforts, simply across government agencies. Because we do have agencies, the emergency services agencies, the first responders, which are SES, RFS. In times of, for the floods, SES was in the response. They're in charge of that response phase. The agency for resilience and now the Reconstruction Authority, we oversee the recovery piece and the coordination piece across the different agencies to make sure, that we're all aligned and, and providing the support that the community needs. So resilience was formed after, the bushfires. It came out that we needed a larger agency with more, abilities to actually coordinate and provide that coordinated approach across government. And yeah, so the most of us were bulk recruited in the lockdown, the second lockdown we had in Sydney, and had joined resilience in that way. So we had, 60 to 70% of the staff were new to the agency. We had onboarded 150 out of, the 240 staff in that time. And so that was roughly between, July and September 2021. So that only gave us literally 4 months. And we could see what was happening. Around about December, we could see what was happening. There was increased, flooding, there was increased rain events. So we had an indication, we thought, okay, something could actually happen. And so we had done some surge planning of what that would look like and how we would respond as an organisation. But because the event was so significant, I think it caught everyone off guard in terms of, it's the largest flood event in Australia in our history. It's had the biggest impact, and we weren't expecting the volumes that came through. So, the emergency services agencies were caught out as well, and we were all responding to this disaster. So, for us, we had a little bit of time to prepare, but not as much as we needed as a new agency. And also, really, from that branding perspective, our role, the role that we play from that coordination perspective. And I think, there was a bit of confusion in that in terms of who was responsible for which phase of, the emergency response versus the recovery. And so, look, I think, we've learnt so many lessons and are applying them, I guess, in this new New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. And we have greater powers as well, which will enable us to be clearer about what is our role and how do we better prepare communities, but also ensure, that we're mitigating and adapting as well in the future. So, yeah, look, it has been a massive learning experience for us, but we did have plans in place for that surge that were drawn upon when we actually hit the event, but we realised that they needed to be much bigger because of the scale of the event.
Right. It's an area I'd like to explore. We've had plans. So Brad talked about the strategic planning that they were doing. Amani talked about the business continuity planning that she was doing. You had a little bit of time to do some planning, but then in each case, there was this recognition suddenly that you're dealing with something a lot bigger here than what you had planned for or expected. So open to all of you, what was that initial reaction, and how did you personally manage to get through it and just go from chaos to getting your head back into, all right, this is what I need to do next?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that. Look, it was quite intense for me because the day of the floods, my car broke down as well. So I had to get kids to school. It was pouring, and then I had to get to the State Emergency Operations Centre. I never worked there before with that fully activated. So there was a lot going on, and I actually didn't get my car back until after, the flood subsided. So that kind of factored into the stress of the family situation at the time. And my daughter had school photos that day, so her hair didn't get done. We've got photographic evidence. It was just a bit of a disaster March last year. So yeah, I think it was, getting there, I guess there was a lot of adrenaline for me. Like, I was pumping full of adrenaline, but I was really encouraged by, our former commissioner, Shane Fitzsimmons, who he was just so calm and collected in that moment. He'd been there, he'd done it before. It was great just to look to leaders like that who had walked through that, who understood what needed to happen. So I really looked up to that leadership and really just took some deep breaths to go, okay, we have 8 hours to pull a report together and to pull this information together, and how do we do that? And really just drew upon the skill sets of the team, the skill sets of others at that point, just to take a step back in that moment. But certainly, the adrenaline was pumping.
I want to talk about what Sarah just touched on there, was about that calmness in moments of chaos. And I think that it's actually something that I reflected on in preparation for this, is that I think that's so important to remember how you hold yourself through these events, through this chaotic, because people look to you, if you're in the middle of it and you're coordinating, they look to you for signs of how things are and how you carry yourself through these types of things can be a strength, can be a source of strength. It's amazing. No matter where people sit within an organization, it's a great leveler, when you're dealing with the unknown. It's like people don't necessarily haven't always necessarily responded to something like this before. It's new, it's different. It's energizing for some people. It's demoralizing for others. It's frightening. It's got all of these emotions attached to it. But I think that if you can bring that sense of calmness and structure to the response in terms of how you are dealing with this, you are responsive but not reactive, if that makes sense. So you're listening you're responding, but it's not a reactive response, it's a measured response. And I think that adds a tremendous amount of calmness and enables people to, right, okay, we've got this, we can get on with it, we're working together as a team. It just builds that sense of, okay, belonging, and we're going to get through it.
It's an interesting one. How do you actually prepare? Because it's not just preparing your organization, it's actually preparing yourself for being able to calm, to be able to step back and breathe. Amani, your thoughts?
Okay. I guess the best judgment of this is really making sure that you take a deep breath and you don't get the emotions get to you, because other than that, you're not going to be able to operate or make the right decisions. The other one, I think Brad alluded to that in terms of project management. What do we need? Whom do we need at this point in time? What outcome do we need to achieve as quickly as possible? Like for us, for example, in the schools, because of the different public orders, we had to keep abreast on daily basis as a diocese. What are the new public health orders for different agencies, whether it's the early education, whether it's the schools, whether it's the churches, whether it's the Catholic care. And that was a daily meeting to enable to decipher and explain, like the committee, the leadership committee would meet every day in order to have updates from every agency about what's happening, what are we going to do about it, and what sort of communication need to follow as a result. The moment of crisis came when we had to, the very first instances of COVID within the schools, where the schools kids had to be sent back home. Traceability had to be monitored in terms of who was there at that time, what's the period that they would have had been infected. The deep cleaning, calling on the deep cleaning, and making sure that all staff and students are able to work from home accordingly. It hit 2 schools at the same time in August 2020, St. Pius Adamstown and Francis Xavier Hamilton, where kids had to be sent to school and the communication happened. It's unfortunate that when these things happened not in one instance, but in 2 instances. Like 12 months later, similar thing happened in terms of having to do that. So making sure that people are communicated with in a timely basis, deciphering what it is that is coming your way in order to make the right decisions and to take actions immediately is the way to go about it.
Right. So one of the key things that things change daily, so you have to have the daily meetings. Sarah, I know one of the things that we talked about before is, what do you do when you find the daily that's still too slow?
Well, I guess we need to identify here that every agency has its own way of managing things as well. So that daily was on the leadership level, the executive level. However, for the Catholic Schools Office or on the ground in terms of what's happening in the school, especially when it comes to bushfires, if things need to be evacuated, you don't wait for that daily decision to be made. It has to be made on the ground at that point in time as a result of what's happening. And therefore, the communication would be back to the center, the central communication, in terms of telling them what the decision is and what action and communication across the board needs to take place. So yeah, like it's a balancing act, because if you've got so many agencies with 60 schools, you cannot wait for a 24-hour turnaround period. Things happen quickly, especially the fires in 2019. They spread in a manner that wasn't anticipated. They also were very, very quick, that even headmaster of one of the schools, their backyard was on fire. They couldn't even evacuate until in terms of the timing. So they had to stay put. So there has been some damage, but that was it, ensuring that they take the precautions within the area that they are within to ensure that everyone is safe.
Yeah, Jurgen, just to go to your question about, reaction, like how do you work? We found we just had to schedule. We were sometimes meeting every hour to regroup if things were moving that rapidly or information was changing that quickly. We had a new data set that came through, or new information that came through, or requests of information. So, by the time we hit midday, often everything had changed, and sometimes we had to draw a line in the sand, because once we kind of prepared, okay, this is the information that we're sending out, and we had to make a quick decision. Are we going to wait to incorporate some new information because things were changing so rapidly? So the team often met, sometimes hourly, sometimes mostly, when we got into a bit of a pattern, it would probably be 3 or 4 times a day. We'd meet, we'd regroup, we'd check in and decide the course of action. And I think, in terms of, and that would help the team as well manage, because there was challenges that came up with people focusing on, different stakeholders. And also just to, I guess, acknowledge as well, just how do you prepare yourself? I think about what others are going through as well. We're all having some kind of stress reaction to the event. Some people are super calm, they've been through it before, others aren't. And also, there are some, that it can be quite challenging in terms of the behavior pieces. But going back to, I guess, doing as an organization, I think it'd be quite powerful to do simulations and to do kind of tests. So I think when you go through that, you're more prepared. My background's in international community development. I did some training, some quite intense training in Red R, where they went through simulations, and they were really helpful to kind of prepare if you get stuck in a riot. And fortunately, I was stuck in a riot in Nepal at one stage, but I knew what to do, and so I wasn't as stressed or concerned about it. So I think very similar with these types of events. I think the more that we can prepare and even do cross-agency simulations, I think people are then prepared and they know how to respond. I think there's something powerful in that, because once you've done something once, the next time you do it, you're naturally just more relaxed and you bring that with you. It's just that first time being in that event.
And that's something when we talk about the transition from the initial reaction into how do you then learn from it, it's something that I'd certainly want to come back to. Brad, you were also saying in your environment, it wasn't daily meetings, it was a lot more agile, a lot more flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. We needed to, as Sarah was saying, we had to meet very, very frequently. Things were unfolding, very rapidly, of course. So it was about, if you want to consider it in terms of an agile sort of approach, it's like you get a scrum together, and then you go out, you do your sprint for the next hour or two, and then you come back again. So it's very short turnaround times. But at the same time, whilst it's very sharp and short, it doesn't take away from the requirement to be really crisp and clear in terms of who's doing what. So there's very clear assignment of responsibilities. So and then of course the recording of all of that information as well. So you've got that, and these are the principles in terms of my background in projects is having that clear audit trail, your background, your documentation. It's all in order. Even under all of this pressure, you've got this foundation that is solid that you can refer back to, because after the chaos is lifted and we're resuming to normal, and I know we'll get to that, you do need to go back and you do need to learn, and there will be questions asked as well about why did you take those decisions? It's very hard to recreate a certain scenario to somebody that wasn't in there, especially under the stress you're in with the changing dynamics and the people and the personalities. You've really got to have those sorts of things recorded. And that's why it's important to have that documentation there for when you are meeting and taking decisions, and also as well when you have those bigger decisions, that escalation criteria I talked about before as well.
I think that a question that I often get, or a comment I often get when I'm training people, is this idea that when you're in an agile mode, you don't have to document, you don't have to record so much, because hey, we just adapt and we keep going as we go. How did you deal with that? Firstly, did you find that sort of attitude your people, we don't have time to document, we don't have, how did you then deal with it and make sure that people were recording, were documenting, not overly documenting, but that they were capturing the right level of detail at the right time?
For me, it was, yeah. Just for me, look, I kind of had to adapt and learn and lead a little bit by example in that regard, and ensure that the team were buying into that. Because you're right, there's an enormous amount of resistance. It's like, I don't have time to do this. I've just got to go out and do this and just get it done. Whereas, you know, and in the wash up of all of these things, you know, people you don't remember things get, you know, a bit hazy. So having that documentation is really important. And I guess having those sorts of conversations to remind people about that this is a passing scenario. You know, this won't be like this forever. And, you know, just like everything else that we deal with in business or life, there will be questions asked at the end of the day. And we need to have something to go back to. It doesn't need to be, you know, an extensive transcript of everything that happened, but we need to capture the key points.
I'll take that as well. Yeah. In terms of agility got to do with the responsiveness, but not with documentation. I wouldn't sacrifice documentation, put it this way. What happened within the diocese, we had a review, like in terms of what's happening in which school, what can other schools learn from it, what is happening in early education centers, what sort of messages can be taken to the community. And just like any incident report for occupational and health and safety, we needed to capture the basic information, especially that each area, each agency is governed by a number of legislative requirements from the government. Therefore, we couldn't sacrifice these for a couple of reasons. One of them is lessons learned and capturing the information. The second is the legislative requirements that force the agencies to do that. At the end of the exercise also, we need to capture lessons learned, what could have been done better. And we had another sort of workshop where people had to be more forthcoming in terms of the information, what could be done. And I'm so glad to say, like, really, the diocese has done a great job in terms of interacting with these emergency situations, responding, communicating with families, taking care of their community, and so on. There's always opportunities for improvement in terms of what's next, how could we do it better for the next time, especially when we're dealing with kids, with staff, with schools and the community as well.
I guess that brings us to this whole question of learning the lessons and making sure that the lessons we learn are both learned and that they are implementable going forward. So if we start thinking or turning our mind a little bit to, we've averted the original initial crisis, how do we now start transitioning back into, call it, normal operations, and then setting us up for the longer term planning? So I know, Brad, for you, it was very much getting back into operational mode, getting stores stocked up. Sarah, you're in the position now where you're beginning to think ahead. Well, all right, what does this reconstruction authority look like and what does it actually do? So if you could just talk a little bit through, what does that process look like for you? What are the things that you've learned, the insights that you could maybe share with the audience?
Yeah, look, I think this is an important point for a few reasons. I think that the first is the people. I think lessons learned is really important for the people in the organisation, because I think after going through something and you know that it's been stressful or it hasn't worked out exactly the same way, you don't want to go through that again, or for have someone else to go through the same experience. And I think for staff, if you manage it well, it can be quite positive. So we did one ourselves as a PMO, and then we fed that up into our divisional, which was people, performance and governance at the time. And there was divisional kind of, reviews done, and then across the agency that was rolled out as well. And I think from that experience, what was within our control, what we could actually change and put into effect, we did. So I've really prioritized that to demonstrate that we have heard and we will put those things in place. And for that's one of those things was, clarification and executive decision on the roles of different teams around the disaster statewide, dashboard reporting. So we still had some decisions to make there as an agency because we're newly formed. So we were able to do that come July, is collaborate and get some decisions. And we took it to the ELT and they could see that we had taken on feedback and to clarify, those issues that were a little bit grey and that were all just kind of holding different things across the agency. So I think that's really important to demonstrate that once you listen, once you understand what those experiences are, that you put something in action, even a little thing at the start. Some of them might be bigger systemic issues that you need to take a longer approach, but if there are quick wins, to do them and to involve all staff in that process, I think is really important in that piece. So I can't, really not to dismiss that, because I think organisations, you can lose staff to burnout. So if staff don't see change and they see the same things happening, they will vote with their feet. So I think is a really important thing for staff wellbeing and retention. But also, using those lessons can be really powerful for organisations to improve outcomes, to improve delivery, improve strategic alignment. It's a powerful tool and mechanism.
And Brad, what did it look like in your environment?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say about when we're transitioning back to a normal situation is that my personal experience was that people were very keen to transition back to normal business as usual, if you like, far too prematurely. It was almost like, the rains have stopped. Oh, there's no more flooding. It's all over. It's like, well, actually, no, that's not the case at all. With these types of events have a really long tail, as I'm sure we're all in violent agreement on. But that's lost in a commercial environment where it's like, right, we've got to get back out there, we've got to get back into business. And so retaining people around that to ensure that the wash up is done correctly and thoroughly, and we're still transitioning in a smooth manner back into normal operations is a challenge. And then to Sarah's point, once it is genuinely finished, we do then go around and we take all that documentation, all those learnings, and we genuinely engage all parts of the business and outside of the business as well, to really listen to what they took away from any particular event, and gather those learnings, build them into our frameworks, our strategic response plans, etc., and the templates and tools. Like, did we really need that information? Did it add value? No. Okay, let's remove that. We don't need, and you can quite often be, especially in this day and age, be overloaded with data and information, and how much of that is really needed in those moments to get crisp responses, and making sure that you're really focused on that data and the timeliness of that data, and then of course turning that into communication that can be gotten out very quickly. I think that again, around the team, as Sarah touched on, that's really important to listen to the responses of the team, how they found it, their feelings, and their responses to those events, and I suppose building that into the learning as well. But I used an analogy earlier, Jurgen, about coming onto the field. And, when you've got an event or a crisis like this, you are bringing the team out on the field. But, team, you don't win a game on the field. You win it in the off season when you're building the team and you're training and you're preparing. That's when you win the game. And that's the important part, about making those connections, keeping that communication out, and keeping those relationships going. And keeping this alive when you are in the off season, so that when it does come around for next time, you're ready to go.
Yeah, interesting analogy there. I was at the Australian Under-21 Hockey National Championships yesterday. My son was playing in the gold medal match, and watching the preparation leading into the tournament, watching the event, even the halftime chat, just we lost the game sadly to WA, but watching the preparation, the learning, and some that was happening there, the preparation that had happened pre-season, not just about skills on the field, but even how they thought about the game, the mental game that they were being trained. A lot of this is about making sure that we learn lessons, but that we do integrate that back into the organization. And Olivia asked a question online, which I'll maybe just see if I can pop up there. How do we ensure that those lessons are integrated and digested by the organization? And then how do you actually measure that as well? So if anyone would like to tackle that one.
I'm happy to take that. Okay, just like any sort of a project or any sort of event, we agreed that we documented it. For example, in terms of COVID, we had the lessons learned in terms of what we can improve. Then it got assigned to every agency in terms of making sure that these lessons will be incorporated. For example, for the PMO, it's really more agility in terms of determining the priorities of the projects to ensure next time we have an event, we can pull that list of projects and go through them in terms of the strategic alignment quickly and pause or stop or mobilize. And therefore, that became one of the criteria that we had for the prioritization that was embedded within our monthly meeting for prioritization. Should an event happen, we quickly can pull that out, add the criteria accordingly, and go through the prioritization exercise once again. And it wouldn't take much time.
Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, look, I think just identifying, I'd probably more start at that granular level, at that team-based level, so the team can actually see the actions and working with those managers and directors and saying, look, this is the feedback, what can we prioritize? And I think also be careful as well, because there'll be a lot of change that needs to happen at once. And I think that's where the PMO can come in and actually help some of that prioritize, some of that continuous improvement and change, but put milestones around it, put deliverables around it, and make sure that they're tracking to outcomes, especially of those significant issues. I think you can absolutely track and measure. And also there might be some testing to do. Like, we're curious about this. We thought this might work, but we didn't actually take this approach, and we'd like to kind of explore that. So I think, kind of embracing some of that innovation that might come out of that learning is actually, let's kind of explore this. There could be a completely different way that we need to work. And I'm glad, just to hear from Brad, he's reflecting on, let's not go back to BAU. Let's actually just stop and think about, the world has changed. Our world has changed. What can we learn from this? Because we don't want to go back to that space. So, I think, there's enormous opportunities as individuals, as professionals, as branches or teams, and, as organizations to grow and improve. And I think the onus does really need to be kind of shared at that, senior management level, to put runs on the board to demonstrate outcomes, because I think you can also get really pulled into busy work and not have time to invest in this. And, staff see it. So at the end of the day, they see it and they will vote with their feet. So I think it's really important to make those organizational decisions to prioritize, the lessons management.
I remember in the early days of the initial response to COVID, having conversations with business leaders and just looking at how differently people reacted or responded. Some managers really stepped up and very quickly got their team on board and motivated and inspired them to go forward, and others struggled to do that. And where they may have been really great leaders ahead of pre-COVID, in the crisis itself, they just fell apart. One of the, we're coming towards the end. So if there are other questions that you have, a follow-up from Olivia, maybe I'll jump into that before I go to my next one. Speaking of the role of the PMO, is there a level of organizational maturity for when the PMO actually becomes redundant? Because PMO practices are BAU, so.
Yeah, look, that's kind of utopia. That's that's fabulous. That's what where we'd like to go. But look, I think it depends on the organizational size. I think because you do need with any PMO, a PMO needs to be agile and adaptive and learning. So I think when if people have landed, okay, they understand how to work, they've got project management principles, everyone's following consistent process. That's fabulous. You've got strategic alignment from decisions through to projects. You still need the role of the PMO to be working with, or some agent to be working with the executive to support the decision making around projects and to ensure that strategic alignment is there. So I think just having great PM practices and experience in the business is wonderful. I do think you do need that enterprise PMO to continuing improving and adapting the approach based on lessons, because those templates and tools, they get out of date. They need to change, and they need to be more agile. Sometimes you might need more detailed tools and templates for certain types of projects, others light touch. And also from that training piece, as people come in and out of the organization, there's lots of movements and changes, and people have different experiences of project management and implementation. So you really do need a PMO to kind of set that context for the agency. This is how we operate. This is our work. This is the decision-making environment, to really enable those project teams, and also to be addressing blockers. So, there are roadblocks and challenges and risks and issues that pop up for projects. You do need advocates, and project sponsors are one. And yes, again, the PMO really needs to work and empower project sponsors and have excellent sponsorship in an agency for this to work. And for that, you do need that kind of coordination piece to set the standard, I think, for those agencies. I've heard from other agencies who have tried to set up PMOs and it hasn't quite worked, and they've had competing project management interests within the organization. And often you can set up quite competing environments where there's no overarching framework. One team does it better than the other, and unfortunately you can end up in a bit of a siloed approach. So my recommendations would be to just have an agile PMO. If you have a lean PMO, that's fine. If the practice is there, you might only need a lean PMO to kind of facilitate that strategic piece at the ELT and make sure that that practice is continuing to evolve. So it just depends really on what type of PMO the organisation needs.
And Brad, what if a lot of what you were doing, I think, aligns with that? But you would never operate. You wouldn't describe yourself as having operated within a PMO sort of structure, would you?
No, not in that particular time frame. I wasn't operating within a PMO. I mean, the role that I had at the time did have a project element to it, but in this particular function, we weren't following any frameworks or anything in that regard, strictly speaking. But like I say, coming from that project background for me, and having my roots in project work from a earlier, I suppose, career, certainly allowed me to apply those principles. It's the principles of running projects that you can absolutely apply. I align to what Sarah was saying. I still think that there's a place for it and a structure there to drive a strategic agenda in a business. I don't think that I've seen plenty of businesses that have tried, to sort of scale out or phase out a project structure, if you like, but and then they just lose that ability, I guess, over time to drive a strategic agenda in a business, and you ultimately lose traction.
Marnie, that's very much.
Yeah, exactly. Like for me, like whatever office you want to call it, enterprise, lean, XPMO, you need that office that will mobilize the strategy and the implementation of the strategy into the projects, as well as sometimes business as usual, because that can change. So if you don't have that bridge that will ensure the implementation of your strategy, what are you using? And the maturity isn't there with any organization I worked for yet to come immediately from the strategy into business as usual. So the structure and the role of the enterprise PMO, whatever we want to call it, needs to be there no matter what the maturity in terms of the project management. If I reflect on the diocese, we had different levels of maturity within different areas of business. One would argue property would have been managing projects for a long time. They have their own methodologies, approaches, and so on. IT was mature in terms of its structure. But when we come to other areas within the agencies and the business, there was none. And therefore, we had to have high-level oversight of at least gate reviews, business case approval, ensuring that the value is captured and it's still aligning to the strategy. And that's what enabled us to stop certain projects, mobilize others, add resources to others. So no matter what the maturity, I feel the need is still there.
So the need is still there. And the ideal structure, so you agree EPMO or value MO, agile, doesn't matter what you call it. At the end of the day, it really needs to be fit for purpose in terms of the organizational maturity and readiness. All right.
Yeah, I think Jurgen, I mean, this often comes up in many PMO conferences. What type of PMO and what's the value and where do you play? And look, I've worked in PMOs, reporting to COO. I've worked in PMOs in a delivery arm that has sat across the organisation. I've worked in PMOs. I was sitting in the corporate services unit. Now I'm back in delivery. I really think it comes down to the needs of the organisation. There are pros and cons where you place a PO and PMO. I think, at the end of the day, the PMO does need to have a seat at that executive leadership table in terms of, that program decision making and project portfolio decision making. So wherever you structure it, ensuring that it does have that buy-in from the executive, buy-in in terms of project decision making, then it can influence. I think when you take away that role, you could be sitting under, a COO, but there's other influences. So you have to really kind of look at where do you align it? And I know that in some organizations, the PMO reports directly to the CEO because the CEO wants that line of sight. He or she wants to see those projects aligning to strategic outcomes and delivery of those outcomes. So it really depends on the organisation and where it's best fit and your level of sponsorship as well and awareness. But yeah, I think a lot of work needs to be done at that executive level as well to get that alignment, regardless of whatever organisation you're in, to demonstrate that you've got that value you can offer to the decision making.
Great, thank you. So I know, Olivia, you were asking whether that's addressed the question that you were inquiring about. We have a few more minutes, and one of the things I'd like to do is to just hear from you your thoughts. You've heard each other's experiences and roles. If you could ask your fellow panelists just one question, one insight, what question would that be? And I think, Sarah, I'll start with you. One question to either Brad or Amman.
I think just the question I have is for Brad in terms of the experience that you had with I guess managing the team and your own personal reflections for you. I'm kind of just curious to understand what you took out of it from a leadership perspective, and how would you maybe approach an emergency situation, chaotic situation differently, again, if that happened.
Frankly, in the time I spent in that particular role within Woolworths and in the function of managing over those certain events, I think that I probably went through the largest learning in terms of my leadership approach and style that I had in my entire career in terms of learnings. And because I think you get exposed to the good, the bad, the ugly in terms of responses and how to manage through a completely foreign situation to what you would otherwise typically be engaged in. I talked a bit before about the approach that I took, and that was certainly one about trying to impress calmness upon a situation, the ability to remove myself from the situation, to take those deep breaths and get that balcony view about what was going on. I think back with vivid memory to a number of, I suppose, points of points of reference within timeframes when I was managing those situations, when I'd be sitting at home, because they obviously happen over a 24-hour period, and having maps on a wall and data and things like that spread around everywhere, and just taking it in and just allowing myself to step out of it for the moment and to say, right, where are we, and where do I go to from here? Who do I need to speak to? I probably engaged more with people and colleagues and so forth more than ever throughout those periods, to bounce ideas off, get information from, learn, adapt. So collaboration is so fundamentally important. As I mentioned before, the way in which I would carry myself try to carry myself at least in a very clear, concise, measured approach when we were managing through those situations. And as I said before, I think the difference between responsive and reactive, it's very easy to react when we're in these moments of crisis and chaos. And it's really important, though, to be responsive and listen to how the team is going, and of course of what is happening in the situation, and always, like any project, having that goal in mind about where is it that we're going, what is it we're driving towards, because there are many avenues to take, and there are many distractions along the way, but we've just got to keep sort of inching towards that end goal, acknowledging we will, I suppose, get things wrong or less than perfect on the way, and being okay with that, and allowing yourself a little bit of that ability to learn and accept it as a learning, but yeah, just continuing to drive towards that outcome. In terms of how I would approach things differently, like as I mentioned, from the first time to the last time I managed one of these events, I was a different person. I walked in full of fear, full of unknowing. I thought I had a plan, and before I knew it, that was swept away with the floods. So quite literally, just about. My ability to adapt, and that applies, I think, to any project now, is that projects always have risk and they always have changes in them. So it's okay to not be so rigid about things and moving towards the goal. We're within a corridor, and we can take alternative paths, and we need to do that to adapt to situations, and encouraging the team to be okay with that as well. And I would always, I suppose, take that into any future sort of event that I'm kind of thrust into.
Great. And I think there was that comment from Deborah earlier about planning for good days and bad days, and actually thinking of alternatives. What could it look like? What are the options? That it's not one clear path that we follow. Great. Thank you. Amani, one question that you would like to pose to either of the two.
Yeah, to both of them, as a matter of fact, in terms of a generic question. PMOs have that reputation that they just require more effort, more time from everyone. They're very undemocratic, intensive, labor intensive. So if there's something that you would like to do in order to change that perception, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit in my presentation, Amani, with how we set up the PMO. My presentation just pop up? Sorry, something happened on screen. But yeah, look, I shared in the presentation where we were forming the PMO at Resilience in 2021. And one of the first things we did a human-centered design kind of survey, and we asked key people around, what makes them feel good about making decisions, what makes them feel uncomfortable, some examples of really good project culture that they've been part of, and projects that have delivered outcomes, what made them work. And so we really got into understand the executive. We interviewed all the executive, and we interviewed project leaders and project team members across different areas of the agency. And so with that, we had a bit of insight that we could pinpoint what are the things that the organisation needs. We were setting it up from scratch, essentially. And I appreciate not everyone has that opportunity to do that. But we took that moment, and we also didn't put the focus on frameworks, tools and templates. We focused on setting up the governance around project decision making, because what we heard is people wanted decisions. They wanted to understand who was responsible for delivering what outcomes, and they wanted decisions. So we're like, we're going to focus on the governance model first. We will keep the profile, we'll get some essential tools and templates there, but we still need to kind of test them and develop them. And then, we did take the test and learn approach when we developed any of those templates. But before we did that, we actually jumped into projects. So there were a few priority projects. We had to move a really important aspect of state security. We had to move that in 12 weeks. And, all of that was in one staff member's head in terms of what needed to happen and how we were going to do that. And so we got thrown into, this meeting because one of the ELT members was aware of the PMO establishing and said, Sarah, can you help us? We need to do this. We've got 12 weeks to do this. This is really important for the state. And we just jumped in, and we worked, we developed agile methodology. We did some coaching. We were doing daily stand-ups. We were managing planning boards, doing retros with the team, and introducing all these tools, which enabled a clear delivery of that project. And then we were actually able to identify some of the significant issues that hadn't been addressed straight up, so we could get that executive decision making happening, which just gave confidence in terms of how we work. So we're I think for a PMO, you have to be pragmatic. You have to be able to translate your work, and you have to be able to demonstrate your value add. Otherwise, people are going to see you as a ticker box and all the police and overarching governance. So it's the language that you use, and taking every opportunity to talk about the behaviors and project culture, and talking about the values and demonstrating that in action. And even with some of the framework, if it doesn't make sense to put one project through a certain pathway, don't push it down the pathway just because you've got the framework. Like, I think there has to be a moment of pragmatism to go, yes, we want consistency with this framework, but is it still working? Is it meeting needs? Do we need to take a different approach? And sometimes we'd do that. We would allow a project to start off in the project planning phase rather than concept brief, because they had already done a fair amount of work that had external approvals. I'm not going to make them go through and start from the start, but I'm going to take the ELT on that journey and communicate why I've made certain decisions, so they are aware of that. So I think it's about being pragmatic, approachable, human-centered, and focusing on culture and behaviours.
I would completely concur with everything that Sarah just said. I think that, but Sarah, you touched on one thing which actually resonates very strongly, or two things actually, was the agility or alignment to the business, and being pragmatic about it, but using language of the business as well. You come in and you use language which is foreign to a business. It's a pretty good way of disorienting them and alienating them very quickly. It's like if you can align to the language they use and the way in which they operate and demonstrate the value very quickly. And I think that you get very limited time to do that with a business. So if you can demonstrate that in a fairly quick fashion, then the confidence will build, the trust will build, and you'll be embraced a lot sooner.
Language, agility, collaboration, I think is something that I heard about. It's not about trying to dictate one path over another, but being collaborative and seeing what the organizations need, seeing what the projects themselves need. Great, thank you. Brad, your turn. One question.
So a question to both Sarah and Amani is, so from my point of view, I was able to operate from within a commercial environment, of course, but when you guys were dealing with chaotic situations, flood crisis and so forth, and other pandemics, coming from a public sector, a not-for-profit I would suggest that the scrutiny on those organisations, simply because they are in the public light, is far greater. How do you deal with that from with the pressure that I get that must come from that? When you're dealing with stakeholders that you have no control over and can say whatever they like about how you're responding.
I'll leave that one to you, Amani.
Oh, okay, that's
I've
all
got
right.
some thoughts, but it is quite challenging, I think, for us to comment.
Yeah, like as I said, for the diocese had its agencies with different set of rules, legislations, and so on. However, each area is well aware of what compliance they need to adhere to, and that's very important in terms of, even if, for example, someone from the executive team, leadership team would suggest something, they are aware of the consequences and the impact, and it's assessed immediately in terms of what it is. So it's a balancing act, usually, in terms of what needs to be done versus the legislation, and making sure that certain lines are not crossed no matter what. Like the diocese, as you would know, has been through a lot in terms of pedophilia and so on. So there are certain lines that cannot be crossed in terms of a crisis, and there are certain rules that cannot be changed accordingly, because, put it this way, it's changing the image, changing the brand, making sure that it's for the benefit of the community, making sure that everyone aware of the consequences, the impact, and that the whole objective is the well-being, the health and well-being of the whole community at large is very critical. So once you have your driver well established and known, then the balancing act in terms of what decision can be made are much clearer to every single person, regardless of where they are operating.
Yeah, look, Brad, I'll have to be just careful with my response, because we've, I guess, experienced a lot of public scrutiny in the last year, and even the former OEM with the bushfires. So I guess just to acknowledge, it is really hard for staff, because when you start to see your brand and your label in the media, and you're working extremely long hours, you haven't seen your family on weekends. We had staff members working, deployed in remote areas, and working really long days, supporting the community and giving it their all, to see the press, to see the news, and to see the brand tarnished, is really, really hard, really disheartening, when you've got people working wholeheartedly and for the cause, out in the field, and to see the public scrutiny of our leader as well at the time, that was really, really challenging. And I think a reflection for us as an agency, the understanding of our role, was not really formed by the time the floods had hit. I think we're a new agency at the time. It had a vision under the previous premier that was that set up resilience, and so it was, I think that I guess the lessons learned is around, with any new agency, you need to be really clear on your role and ensure that others are clear on your role, because I think that role clarity, it meant that people were looking for us, they were looking for someone to blame for the floods, significant event, and I guess it's just human nature. Who's responsible for this, even though it's a systemic issue. We're all learning from the experience. Everyone was doing their best, but there were some failings, and so look, it's really quite hard. But I'm just reflecting on your question, and just remember a question that our comms team had. They were getting calls from media asking them about when's the weather going to stop. Why aren't they stopping the rain? Almost like the intensity and I think the ridiculous nature of some of that pressure, in terms of we're not responsible for the weather. We're really not responsible for the weather. um, but that was felt, I think, across the agency. So I think it's really supporting staff with that, and being really clear on purpose and approach, and ensuring that stakeholders are clear as well. So that I guess that's the best you can do. But absolutely, Brad, like, well, I think in the public sector you're under much greater scrutiny, and rightly so. We are here to support the community of New South Wales, and we need to be transparent with our approach and also transparent with our learnings. And I think that's just something we are taking those learnings moving forward in the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority.
Thank you.
I'm going to pose that same question back to Brad from a commercial perspective, but just before I give Brad the opportunity, Sarah, I'm going to put you under a bit of a challenge. Can you pull up that slide of the dogs again? Because I think
Oh, yes.
I'd like to actually end up on that in a moment. So while you do that,
I will. Yeah.
Brad, from a commercial perspective, you have this reality of, yes, there's the disaster, humanity is really important, but you also have a commercial imperative. So how did you balance that?
Well, yes, I guess the good part about when these events took hold was that the commercial elements of the business definitely take a backseat in those moments, and but what you can't forget, and this is why I said before, it's really important about having those clear escalation paths, those decision-making rights, those points of documentation, is because sooner rather than later, the commercial reality comes back, and the sense that we got through this, we were able to help the community and re-establish the community in a very quick fashion. Those moments, they fade, and then the invoices, the bills, they start coming through the door, and the reality is like, wow, this was a lot of effort. This consumed a lot of money. So that's when it became super important to be able to go back and justify why we did what we did. Because you do need to do that at the end of the day, and that's why it's important, like I said, to have that foundation of that documentation, that decision making. Who made the decisions? Why did you make the decisions? You can't recreate that space ever again, and the circumstances under which the decisions were made, but you can absolutely document the sense and I suppose the key pieces of information that went into driving those decisions, because you are held accountable at the end of the day to making and having those decisions made. And you've got to be able to sort of go back and say, well, this is the scenario, and that's when the lessons learned come out as well. Would we do that again? Would we do something different? Would we do something more? Again, it's all a part of that learning process.
So as we bring this to a close, I think if I can recap, and I think Sarah will come to that slide in just a sec. If I can just recap, for us to be able to deal with these disasters, the role of a PMO at a senior level in organisation is a really critical one to help us at three different stages. The one is before the disasters begin, to start thinking ahead, to start doing scenario planning, to start thinking of what would we do, how would we deal with that particular situation. It's even whether it's through the PMO or some other part of executive management, to start preparing the leaders to actually be able to respond appropriately in crisis. So when suddenly chaos breaks out, how do you remain that calm person that others will turn to and look to and say, all right, I'll follow you because you seem to know what's going on. So that's all of the pre-planning. In the moment of the crisis itself, the things that I heard were really clarity of communication, clear, consistent, frequent, not overly communicating, but frequent communication. It's being timely in that communication, making sure people know what's expected, people understand what decisions need to be made, and who's going to be making that in that particular moment. Remaining calm, no matter how chaotic it is, just remaining calm, giving people an opportunity to think through, but drawing on people, allowing them to think through and to actually bring who they are. And then as soon as possible after the emergency or the crisis, it's about sitting down with them again and saying, all right, what worked, what didn't work, how do we adapt our plans, how do we bring that back into the next crisis that may occur. Sarah, see that's, there it is, I think. So I'm going to, as we wrap this up, in her presentation, Sarah showed a tool that she often uses in her presentation. So have you got the right one up on?
Yeah, I got the check-in up. Yes, that's it. Is that it? Was the check-in?
Yes, that's the one, the check-in one. So a way that you used within your teams, and you actually talked about at the beginning of your presentation, the dog that you felt. And so we've come to the end of our panel discussion, and I will thank you formally, but I'd like very quickly, each of you, look at those dogs, tell us which one are you? Sarah.
Oh look, I'm probably in the delighted. You know, it's just been wonderful just to reflect. I feel like with colleagues, and you often don't take the time out to do this reflection. And I've just been really encouraged by Amani and Brad and yourself, Jurgen, just some of your insights. And yeah, so I'm probably sitting there. But I like that I woke up like this. I've got a whippet, and they're absolutely adorable. So yeah, I love this tool. And you can use this tool. There's cats, and there's lots of different tools you can use for a check-in. Just to give it a plug, it's yeah, it's a great kind of approach to kick off a meeting.
Good way to de-stress. Good way to end the meeting too. So Amani, 10 seconds. Which dog? Why?
I am delighted, but also ready for business. So thank you for this opportunity. It's been great.
And Brad.
I would say delighted as well. It's been a fantastic experience, and it's certainly brought back a lot of fond memories for me. You know, talking them through my experience with the panel today and hearing from their experiences as well. And I hope that everyone got something out of it. So delighted for me.
Great. Thank you. And mine.
What about you, Jurgen? Jurgen, what about
almost
Jurgen?
Friday.
Oh, almost Friday. Okay.
Yeah, no, it has been really great having all three of you on the panel. Thank you very much. I trust the audience has learned something from it too. Be prepared. Put those plans into action. Don't be wedded to them, but keep thinking through, seeing what it is that you can do. Speaking of what it is that you can do, remember, we are here to support a worthwhile cause. So as we go to the break, please feel free to do some networking. Have a look in the studio. There's some videos about what PMI does. There's some videos about what CARE does, where your funds would go to. But above all, remember to hit that contribute button and share something from your side as well. We're going to go to a short break before we move to our next speaker. So thank you all to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. Grab some coffee, grab some chatting, pay some money, and I'll see you back soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Jurgen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.